Good afternoon and welcome to the IISS. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Senior Fellow for Security and Development here at IISS. Today I'm here to introduce Professor Sir Paul Collier. Well, in truth, as a world-renowned economist, Professor Collier needs very little as a way of introduction. Currently a Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. He has also previously served as Director of the Research and Development Department of the World Bank. His work and books, including The Bottom Billion, Wars, Guns and Votes, The Plundered Planet, Exodus and Refuge, have earned him a number of awards and in 2014 a knighthood for services to promoting research and policy change in Africa. Today, we are fortunate to have him here with us to share the findings and conclusions of his most recent research and policy work, outlining a new approach to replace the international refugee system and to address state fragility that is often at the origin of refugee and migrant flows. Professor Collier will speak for about 20 minutes on the record, and after that we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments from the floor. But enough for me. Professor Collier, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. There are any number of fragile states. I mean, I'm co-running a commission on state fragility, and we don't try and count them or say this is fragile, this isn't, but different states have different degrees of fragility. Fragility is a sort of proneness to meltdown. There may be 50 or 60 states that are significantly fragile, and at any one time there may be 4 or 5 that have collapsed into meltdown. When they collapse into meltdown, then large chunks of their population get displaced, and a proportion of the displaced then flee across an international border and become refugees. So at the moment there are about 65 million displaced people in the world. About a third of them get across an international border and so become refugees. That 65 million is an all-time post-war peak, both as an absolute number and even as a proportion of the world's population. And that's quite disturbing. It suggests that the rate of collapse into meltdown is higher than the rate of escape. You know? So that the stock of the displaced is gradually accumulating. So that's the sort of the backdrop to what I'm going to be talking about. Clearly, gradually we want to move to a lower incidence of meltdown and a higher incidence of escape from meltdown. But in the meantime, we've got this stock, and presumably there'll be a continuing flow of meltdowns. And so we'll have a continuing problem of displacement and refugees. So the first few minutes of my talk, I want to talk about getting a much more viable approach to actually responding to the needs of refugees and the displaced, what I call the duty of rescue. And that's the book, Refuge. But then the more fundamental challenge is to reduce the incidence of fragile states getting their number called and collapsing into meltdown. And for that I'm co-running a commission, an independent commission funded by the British Academy on a commission on state fragility. And we're about halfway through our work. We'll report probably around April. So the last part of my talk will be about some preliminary thoughts from that work on state fragility. So starting with a new approach to refugees and displacement. It's not been a long-term theme of my work. I got brought into this by a request in 2014 from the government of Jordan. Governor Jordan wrote to me saying, you seem to have ideas on economic development, please come and help, we've got a nightmare. And I paired up with Alex Betts, which turned out to be a very good pairing. He's been the director of the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, which is the world's foremost academic centre. So he came with a lot of knowledge about refugees, and I came with knowledge about economic development. And it was a very happy meeting of minds. So it turned out to be a very easy book to write because we rapidly reached the same conclusions. One of those conclusions was that the existing international system for dealing with refugees, which is basically UNHCR, is absolutely hopeless. Not to mince words. It's based upon a model invented in 1948 for a completely different situation, which arose as the first outcrop of the Cold War. Was a lot of East European countries were falling into behind the Iron Curtain, becoming part of the Soviet Empire, and the Democrats in those countries who were trying to re-establish democracy were being persecuted and were fleeing to the West. And the Russians were then saying, you know what the rules are that were used in 1945? Hungarian soldiers caught in the West, you sent them back to Hungary. Do the same with these guys now, the Democrats fleeing to the West. And so the origins of UNHCR and the whole legal infrastructure for refugees was about trying to respond to individual persecution, and so creating a legal basis for not sending persecuted people back as individuals to the newly communist states. So specific was that the initial remit of the legal framework was time-bound and geography-bound. It was supposed to apply to Europe until, I think, 1950. And then, in a classic act of Eurocentrism, it became global and permanent. And the UNHCR dealt with this transitional flux of East Europeans westwards by the perfectly sensible solution of what did people need during European winters when they were in transit. They needed temporary shelter and temporary food. And so you provided temporary food, temporary shelter for these persecuted people. That made a lot of sense then. They've still got the same damn model. And now it makes no sense at all. The whole framework of refugees completely changed. Only a tiny minority are individuals being persecuted. The vast bulk of that 65 million displaced people are not individuals being persecuted by a government. They're people fleeing en masse, groups fleeing en masse from states of physical insecurity, either due to the collapse into violence, the breakdown of states, or famine. Or, as in South Sudan at the moment, the combination of both. Right? Because the state broke down, there was violent disorder, so people couldn't plant their crops, and so now there's famine. Right? So about half the population of South Sudan's displaced, which is the latest displacement. So the model UNHCR stuck to was food, shelter, and they developed they had 60 years to perfect it. When I do this talk with Alex, he's got a marvelous image of the model UNHCR camp developed in the early 2000s, which, as he says, is a modernist vision of hell. But it's still that model of food, shelter. Now, of course, refugees are stuck as refugees for years. It's not a temporary transit. Large majority of refugees don't want life in free food, free shelter, nothing to do in a camp. And so they ignore the camps. We reckon something like 90% of the entire world's refugee population completely bypasses the UN system. What they do, instead of going to camps, they go to cities. Why do they go to cities? Because they can do what refugees fundamentally need to do, is re-establish some autonomy in their lives, and they do that by finding a job. Now, in the legal structure, haven countries are not required to allow refugees to work, and they don't, because the refugees are obviously seen as a threat in poor societies to the work of the local population. But if you go to the cities, it's hard to stop you working at the bottom of the jobs market. So that's what refugees tend to do. How could we do better than that? Well, the key thing is to enable refugees to work legally in the haven countries. What I mean by the haven countries is the countries adjoining conflict, breakdown states, which are themselves at peace, but approximate to conflict. Most refugees are in about 10 haven countries around the world, and if we had time, I'd tease you as to which ones they are. Right? When I give this talk in Germany, guess who the Germans think is the top haven country in the world, right? No OECD country makes it into the top 10, right? All the top 10 countries are dirt poor, right? They have only one thing in common, which is not kindness to refugees or anything like that. It's that they're close to conflict. And that makes a lot of sense. If you're fleeing with your family from famine or disorder, the best you can do, get across the border. It's close, easy to get to, easy to get back from. What refugees most want is to go home. They're the people who chose not to be migrants. They chose to stay home. Their homes have become unsafe. They have to move. They want to go back home, right? So would you, right? So how could we do better? In Jordan's case, it was quite obvious. You needed to have a model in which the government of Jordan was willing to let people work legally. And we encountered a situation where the international donors were trying to pressure the government of Jordan into doing that. And unsurprisingly, the government of Jordan was saying, very definitely not. We're a poor country, we've got unemployment in our own population, we're not going to do that. We're willing to provide a physical haven. I was brought in because Jordan had the costs of looking after these refugees had exploded and had hit the Jordanian national budget. And so its debt level had exploded. The response of the West from 2011, when the problem started, to 2015, which was when I got there, is what I called the response of the heartless head. Europe had said, oh, not our problem. You pay for it. Right? So what we came up with was, talking with the Jordanian government, was to say, if the international community came up with a lot of funding, and more particularly brought in a lot of international firms to bring jobs in to Jordan, because Jordan was stuck in a middle income trap. It was a bit of a sort of nowhere place, wasn't on the sort of international map, didn't get access to the European market or anything like that. So we said, suppose we put a package together in which jobs came to Jordan, and you split those jobs between new jobs for Jordanians and new jobs for refugees. Would you agree to that? And the government debated it for 6 weeks, and then they decided, yeah, if you could do that package, we'd buy it. And so Alex and I then worked with the World Bank, with the British government, which then convened a big conference in London, February 16, on that package. And the Jordanian government went so far as to say, if you can bring in jobs, we're willing to issue up to 200,000 work permits. That would have been a job for every Syrian household refugees in Jordan. So then the challenge came, okay, let's do this. Since I used to work with the World Bank, I went to my friends in the World Bank. One of the guys who used to work for me was fortuitously the chief economist of the Middle East. So I said, well, what are you doing in Jordan? And he reminded me, don't be stupid, can't you remember? We can't do anything in Jordan. It's a middle-income country. On our rules, we're out of Jordan. Million refugees, not in our rules. If it's a refugee, it's UNHCR. They've got the monopoly. What did UNHCR say to our ideas? Well, privately, I can say that every senior official of UNHCR is cheering us on, saying, go for it. The official response was extreme indignation, encapsulated in the reply, we are not a jobs agency, which is indeed the problem. Right? They're not. Right? They're totally not equipped to be a jobs agency, which is unfortunate because that's what refugees most need. I talked with my friends at the World Bank and said, you should have a facility for the haven countries hosting refugees. There are an awful lot of them now. Just because Jordan isn't a low-income country doesn't mean it's not got some very, very needy refugees, about 1 million of them. And so to the great credit, the World Bank team for Jordan put together a package saying, and put it to the World Bank board. A loan, an IDA loan, very soft terms, $300 million to create jobs in Jordan. And the World Bank's board debated it, and usually, I've told the executive directors on the World Bank always manage to find faults with projects, proposed projects. This time, everybody wanted to speak, and everybody wanted to say, what a great idea, let's do it. 60 years too late. Right? And so 300 million was immediately given to Jordan, another 300 million to Lebanon, and now there's a $2 billion facility, renewable every 3 years, to help economic development in haven countries, with the idea being that you have to help the haven country. There has to be some gain for the haven country as well as for the refugees. Otherwise, the haven countries, why should they be havens? And the principle that Europe and North America should follow is the duty of rescue applies to us just as much to the neighboring countries like Jordan. So the solidarity with the haven countries, but comparative advantage. Their advantage is to provide the physical space for haven. Our comparative advantage is to provide the money and the firms that can create jobs. Use globalization to the advantage of refugees. For example, German firms have created hundreds of thousands of jobs in Turkey for the last 30 years. That's how modern globalization works, a huge integration. German factories in Turkey, the near offshore. It's absolutely easy to use that structure to employ refugees. Absolutely easy. And instead of doing that, Germany went from the heartless head. In 2014, it had actually halved its contributions to UNHCR food payments for the camps. So it lurched from the heartless head to the headless heart and said, swim to Germany, which had tragic consequences. Most refugees didn't take up that offer because most refugees want to go home. But a minority of the Syrian population, a little under 5%, moved to Germany. The refugee exodus from Syria was a perfectly random sample of the Syrian population. Fear strikes randomly. The Syrian population movement to Germany, though tiny compared to the refugee efflux, the Syrian population movement to Germany was highly selective. This was not refugees, this was elite migration. It was selective in three respects. One, it was overwhelmingly male. Two, it was overwhelmingly affluent for the very simple reason that you had to buy a place from the Latin American people smuggling gangs. And the Latin American people smuggling gangs were charging something around $2,000 a place. Annual income in Syria before the conflict was only $2,000. Right? So I ask you, work out your annual income and then ask yourself, can I put my hand in my pocket and in the next week raise that cash? Because that's what you have to do. Right? Who are the people who can manage to do that? They're the Syrian rich. And so overwhelmingly this was selective, the Syrian affluent, liquidating some assets and sending the son off. But the main selective aspect of the migration was neither gender nor affluence, it was education. As I say, something less than 5% of the Syrian population is in Germany, but Alex and I estimate that something between a third and a half of all Syrians with university education are now in Germany. For the recovery of Syria, that's disastrous. They're the very people who will be needed to rebuild the society. Meanwhile, having got to Germany, if you actually want to create jobs for refugees, Germany is about the last place on earth you would put refugees. Because Germany, above anywhere else, has perfected the model of making ordinary people very skilled. And it does that by long periods of training, vocational training, and followed by certification processes. And so recruitment into work is on the basis of these credentials acquired through long processes of training, vocational training. So even though Germany took the cream of Syrian population, the most educated, after 2 years there, it's only managed to employ 14% of them. So that model, which of course provoked such outrage in the German population that Chancellor Merkel abandoned it within 6 months, did a deal with Turkey to send them back. That model was really what I call the headless heart. It played well on the television screens of the world for a couple of months, but it was actually deeply dysfunctional. So much for refugees. Let me move on to the deeper problem of fragile states. On the Commission, we've identified 5 features which we think form a syndrome of state fragility. And so I'll just run through the 5 features and then spell out their implications. The starting point is that the state lacks legitimacy with its own citizens. The citizens don't trust the state. The second is that the state lacks capacity to actually deliver many services. Fragile states are incompetent states. The third feature is that it's one aspect of their inability to deliver services, they're unable to deliver security. And so there's physical insecurity, or the high risk of physical insecurity. If private organized violence emerges, they can't do much about it. Fourth feature is that the formal private sector, proper firms, are largely absent because firms are not crazy. They don't want to go there. Small markets, reputational risk, little money to be made. And the fifth feature is that these states are highly prone to shocks but have few cushions to absorb them, and so they've got low resilience. These 5 things feed on each other. If you think about it, because the state's got low legitimacy, for example, people won't be willing to pay taxes. And so the state won't have revenues with which to deliver services. And so it will have low capacity. One manifestation of low capacity will be inability to provide security. In an environment of low state legitimacy, insecurity, and very few public services, little infrastructure, the private sector won't emerge, except for the crooks who go in to rape and pillage. So the economy never develops. The economy is therefore very narrowly based, and the politics is illegitimate, and so you're subject to both economic shocks and political shocks, and the state itself has got very little capacity to withstand those shocks. And so even if you start painfully to emerge, you're hit by a shock which knocks you back. Even if you manage to climb up a ladder, you hit a snake. So that's the syndrome, we think. Now, these 5 features have a dual importance, each of them. Each of them is something that we need to change. That's kind of obvious. But, and what is generally neglected, is each of these features is a constraint on what can be done. And that second feature is awfully important. So I'm now going to, in my closing minutes, parody what I think has been the international approach of the last 15 years or so. And it will be a deliberate parody, right? But the punchline of it is the last 15 years of intervention on fragile states have obviously largely failed. Even in Afghanistan, where we've had enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of security manpower relative to anything that will be politically feasible anywhere else, even there with that huge approach, many billions of dollars, over 100,000 men, it's getting worse, not better. So, failure. Why failure? So here's the parody. The parody is that we, first of all, we think we can fix the legitimacy problem quickly by the technique that works in our own countries. How do you get a legitimate state in our own countries? Easy. You hold an election. Right? So, that's the universal panacea for illegitimacy, hold an election. Right? Manifestly doesn't work. Right? Just because they work in our own societies, we fail to realize that they work in our own societies because the state is legitimate. It's not a means for making the state legitimate. Then we go in and we have a long-term vision of the society. This place is a mess now, but we need to be guided by a long-term vision. The long-term vision is always the same. It's Denmark. Right? In 20 years, this place will look like Denmark. Right? And then, having got that long-term vision, you start to say, right, what do we need to do? In what respects is Afghanistan or Central African Republic or Mali or wherever, in what respects is it not like Denmark now? You come up with a rather long list, because on any aspect you care to look at, it ain't like Denmark. Right? And that then becomes the agenda for what you need to do to put it right. And so you have a comprehensive program divvied up amongst the donors. Japan will do this, Germany will do that. We'll all do our bit. And what that collides with is a desperate capacity constraint. The capacity constraint is such that maybe, if you're lucky, you could do 3 simple things. And instead you try and do 100 difficult things. The result is that they all fail. That's awfully important, because here's a little psychological test. Probably won't work on this audience, but this is established from experimental social psychology. If we ask you, how did your football team do last week? If it won, you're very likely to say we won. If it lost, you're very likely to say they lost. Did you hear it? We won, they lost. Right? You're subtly shifting your identity, your own identity, towards success, away from failure. Right? In fragile states, you've got a demoralized public sector, a demoralized civil service. Fail, fail, fail. And then you try 100 things which all fail. It makes it worse. Right? So, in my last 2 minutes, here's what I think should be done. Right? But maybe it's wrong. Right? I think we shouldn't have these long-term visions. Once you've got a long-term vision, you inevitably start to say, oh, so what needs to be done? We need a strategy to get there. Right? Our own societies, the societies that are not very fragile, don't all look like Denmark. Right? We've all found different ways of evolving towards societies that more or less are not fragile, even if they're far from perfect. Right? We can't trace a vision for what should a successful Afghanistan look like in 20 years. That's ridiculous. And so we should navigate short term. The only things that matter is, will it work in the short term? If it won't work in the short term, you never get to the long term. Short term probably means about 2 years. And then think, what are the things we could do which would actually work, be successful? Success is really important. Visible success. Visible, quick success. Maybe there are 3 things you can do. What will those 3 things be? I've no idea. You better go and look. Right? As testimony to the Commission, we got the former Prime Minister, the technocratic Prime Minister of Tunisia, who'd been Prime Minister in 2014. He gave a brilliant testimony, and one of the things he'd worked out was this. They'd only got a window, the technocrats. They came in because the previous sort of Islamic regime had clearly had recognized it better get out of the way for a bit. So they brought technocrats in just for a short period. So they knew they got a year. They knew they'd no capacity. They knew they'd no legitimacy whatsoever. They thought, what can we do that's actually going to be visible and work? What they came up with would not have been on any donor list of the top 100 things in turning somewhere into Denmark. Right? What they came up with was a public commitment. What are we going to do? We're going to clean the mosques. Right? That played very well because the suspicious people were the Islamists. So they hadn't expected this bunch of technocrats to say, we'll clean the mosques. Right? It was visible, it was feasible, they did it, they won a bit of space, a bit of legitimacy. Right? That is, I think, the sort of smart tactics that gradually, if you do three things that succeed and you say you're going to do them, and then you'll start to get people buying in to success and things gradually open up. Right? But that, I think, is likely to be the route out of fragility. So, on that note, I'll stop. I think I've overrun my 20 minutes. Sorry.
Well, you did, but it was fascinating. So thank you so much for a very rich, insightful, and engaging set of remarks. We do have some time for questions and comments from the floor. If you would like to ask a question, just please raise your hand and wait for me to call on you. A microphone will be brought to you. And before you ask your question, please, if you could give us your name and affiliation, that would be great. We already have one on the first row, please. And then at the bottom.
Nicholas McLean, would your Jordanian solution work in Bangladesh? And have you looked at the Rohingya problem?
Okay, so I haven't looked at Bangladesh, but I don't see why it wouldn't. Bangladesh is very heavily inserted into the global economy, and it's got a $20 billion a year export cluster in garments for a start. Entirely feasible for example, for big retailers in Britain or America or continental Europe to say, we'll actually buy more stuff from you as long as the jobs are shared between refugees and locals. What is now called the Jordan model has already been imitated. It's been picked up in Ethiopia and it's being picked up in Malaysia. So it's seen as a perfectly viable future model. So I don't see why it can't work in Bangladesh at all.
Okay, the gentleman over there at the bottom.
Thank you. I'm John Rain. I'm the Senior Consulting Fellow here for Geopolitical Due Diligence. Your vision for how we improve integration, in particular, of refugees is very compelling. But I wonder, what thoughts do you have on how we deal with the other side of this problem, which is I was the government for a long time, so I'm familiar with that, which is how do you get governments who have set their faces against the presence of refugees, rather than it being a question of what role they play in society, it's just the presence and location of them. How do you get them to change their views?
Yeah.
Particularly if they've been driven by a strong political agenda, which is just deeply unhelpful.
Yeah, I think one of the disasters of the Merkel approach has been within Europe to radically change how people envision refugees. For 60 years, people responded in the obvious way for thinking about refugees, compassion and the duty of rescue. And now, the dominant European response is fear. When somebody says refugee to them, they think fear. I was just in Belgium yesterday, and this is the dominant survey response in Belgium, fear. Right? So we've got to get back from that. We've just got to get back from that. I think there's a viable narrative, which is that we have a moral duty towards refugees, a global solidarity towards refugees, not just the refugees, but the displaced, the larger group, the 65 million. And there is a very feasible way of restoring human dignity to refugees, which is the dignity of autonomy. And that refugees are not natural migrants. They desire to go home if they can. Failing that, they've staggered across some border, and let's try and create a mutually beneficial situation in those haven countries. It worked politically in Jordan. It was hard, but the government itself chose this. They recognized that they were in a middle income trap, and one narrative I used with them was, you've got this moment when you've got some bargaining power with the international community, and instead of seeing refugees as your golden opportunity to get on to the international map and get out of the middle income trap, instead you're just treating refugees as a problem. You're not going to send them away, and so now I should say one consequence of the Merkel deal with Turkey, which was very worrisome. Remember, the Merkel deal with Turkey will give you 3 billion if you promise not to send us any more and take them back. Within a month of that, one of the African governments said, right, we're kicking out our refugees. And sure enough, of course, the donors said, please don't. And the African government said, well, it'll cost you. And so the donors then paid up. Right? So we've got to get out of that mentality, which we inadvertently fell into, of refugees as hostages. That's what it came down to. Right? So we've got to get back to the narratives of solidarity and duties of rescue, but of mutual benefit to the havens. I think it's a viable narrative, but we better start building it. Sorry, that was a long answer to it.
The lady in the third row there, please.
Is there a case for adding crime and corruption to the 5 tenets that you talked about with fragile states? And could you, because I come from, I originate from Jamaica, more people live outside Jamaica than live in there. And the crime thing is, and you just mentioned in a kind of veiled way, corruption and governments.
So, would you mind introducing yourself? So.
I'm just a Jamaican. Collier is my name.
Well, nice to have you come in.
Yeah, and you've hit a very pertinent point. So one of the things that we're trying to do on this commission is say, okay, if the state has got very limited capacity, what are the vital capacities? What can a state just not do without? And one of those things is the rule of law. And so we try to peel it back to about 3 vital capacities. There are loads of nice to haves. Yeah? There are loads of things that if the state doesn't do it for a while, you can find alternative provision. NGOs can do it or something. But the rule of law is one of those things that it's the state or it doesn't happen. And so getting back to the rule of law is both vital and difficult. So we're actively working on that. I mean, my last, in July I did an article for the Times Literary Supplement on corruption, basically. I'm just working with an African government at the moment on sending out a team of people to try and reduce corruption in the police force. So you're spot on, right? But it's not easy, which is why, as you say, a lot of people vote with their feet. But of course, voting with your feet doesn't solve the struggle within the country. These struggles have to be won. The escape of the few is not a substitute for the provision of an effective state. Yeah.
There are a few people who would like to ask questions, so I'll take them in groups now. First, the gentleman on the second row over here.
Thank you. Pierre van Hooyland from CDC, the UK's Development Finance Institution. You mentioned the role of the private sector in improving conditions in fragile states. And clearly, one of the instruments a government has is to go through development finance institutions and see whether you can finance them. And yet you very clearly said the enabling environment for investment may just not be there, including not just financial returns, but reputational issues for DFIs like ourselves. What do you see the role of DFIs to be in these difficult situations?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Yes. Sorry, can we just take the others as a group? Yeah. And the gentleman over there.
Thank you. Jonathan Rosenthal from The Economist magazine. And actually, a related question, so it's useful to chunk them. So, Paul, I was struck by your comments about comparative advantage in terms of saying we in the rich world have the money and the firms. And clearly it's easy to, well, perhaps not easy, but it is in the gift of governments to send money. What were the lessons about how one creates the right incentives to get firms into haven states?
Question. Yeah, same
so
question, yeah.
Yes, and the third is Samir Puri over here.
Samir Puri, lecturer in King's College London. Slightly different question. To what extent do your insights around ameliorative responses apply to IDPs as well? Obviously, the political context is completely different, and the notion of internal, external isn't really there. But just thinking about a country like Ukraine with 1 million or so IDPs, and many of the same principles do seem to apply, but probably not in exactly the same form.
Yeah. Let me take that first. There's 2 points here. One is we may need to make it easier for IDPs to become refugees. Often people stay internally displaced because either they're not allowed over borders or the prospects over borders are so ghastly. And so if you can provide the dignity of work within the neighbouring country, the neighbouring country, first of all, if it's mutual benefit, the neighbouring country won't close the borders, which happen periodically with Syria. And it will be something that people can say, let's get across that border. There's hope across the border. So that's part of it. But the other part is that you've got to accelerate the recovery when it happens. And part of all this is the idea that you incubate the post-conflict recovery even whilst the conflict is still happening. And you do that by this business of getting jobs and firms to be employing the refugees, and when the conflict over, and they nearly all do end, the refugees can go back, the firms can go with them. And it's not a zero-sum game. If a firm is profitable in Jordan, it can stay in Jordan with its Jordanian workers. And if its Syrian refugee employees want to go back to Syria, that firm can also set up a branch working in Syria. There's also, very important, you incubate, you provide refuge not just for Syrian people, but for Syrian firms. You set up zones with both the physical and the legal infrastructure so that Syrian businesses can continue. I mean, just think that the main business center in Syria was Aleppo, and look what happened to Aleppo, right? And so you needed a place where not just people from Aleppo could go, but the firms in Aleppo could go. Yeah? And so the internally displaced, at least as soon as the conflict ends, have something. Let me turn to the private sector questions, because they also follow from the incubation question. Firms are not stupid. They're unlikely to go to fragile states. And yet without them, the private economy won't develop. And if the private economy doesn't develop, the states will never get out of fragility. Part of the path out of fragility is undoubtedly economic growth. And so it is of vital public interest that firms go where they don't want to go. And there's only one way of getting them. It's no good preaching to them. Public money needs to be spent to make that feasible. And so there is a public benefit, and so there should be public money behind that public benefit. The public money should pay firms for the public benefit. Right? I mean, let me give you a practical example. Right? I'm a director of a little firm in Sierra Leone, post-conflict fragile state. And what are we trying to establish? We're trying to re-establish rice growing in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, fertile country, easy to grow rice, and yet 95% of it is the staple food, but 95% of it is imported. Right? Why is it imported? Partly because the Lebanese business cartel has basically the cartel on the imports, so has no interest in encouraging domestic rice production, the last thing they want. Right? But also because there are bottlenecks in establishing domestic rice. Even if peasants grow it, they can't mill it. There's scale economies in milling. They can't brand it, package it. They can't distribute it. The distribution chains are in the hands of the Lebanese. Right? So our little firm is doing that. We're already the biggest domestic rice producer in Sierra Leone, which is not saying anything as grand as it sounds. Right? One of our big costs is to run a rice mill in Sierra Leone. It is a certain skill job. There aren't those skills in Sierra Leone. And so you have to bring in an expatriate. That's hugely expensive to get an expatriate to go work in rural Sierra Leone running a rice mill. Right? One of the instructions, of course, for the expatriate is train some locals. Right? There's two possibilities for our firm. We succeed, we fail. We fail, we go bust at the end of it. Right? We succeed, suppose we become profitable, what will happen? Other firms will come in and imitate us. Is that good for Sierra Leone or bad? It's great. Is it good for us? No, it's bad. Right? Competition. What's worse, firms that come in will need some trained labour. to run the rice mills. Where will they get them? They'll poach them from us. Right? That's what's called an externality. Right? We're paying the enormous costs of doing that, enormous relative to the size of the firm. Right? We shouldn't be paying that. Right? There should be public money behind that sort of thing. Right? So, I'm very pleased that I'm on the advisory board of IFC, which is the international equivalent of CDC. I should say CDC is a long way ahead of IFC. You've the last 5 years been the one agency that's moved big time into this field. But IFC is just starting, and for the first time, IDA's the big aid money that the World Bank gives. For the first time, again, it's like the refugee thing. For the first time, they've woken up that they better get some firms into fragile states. And so they've set aside $2.5 billion worth of IDA. It's only 3% of IDA. Is what's called the private sector window, which is money, IDA money going to IFC to help firms go to fragile states. Now, the myth that they had to do to sell it to the board was that this was an IDA investment. IDA would get all its money back and more. If they do, it will be a damn shame. They won't be doing their job. We actually had somebody from MEGA, which is the political insurance, risk insurance agency of the World Bank, to testify to our commission. Fragile states, high political risk, this is the sort of thing that the World Bank should be really covering, right? So we asked the MEGA vice president who came about their, what's your, what happens to your risks? And they said, oh, well, we have a very, very low default rate. We basically, we don't have any losses to cover. As one of my colleagues pointed out, that means you're not actually taking any risks. Right? You're not doing your job. Right? If you're a public agency investing in fragile states and doing your job right, you'll probably lose money. If you're a MEGA providing political risk insurance in dangerous places and doing it right, you'll probably lose money. These are good uses for aid. I tell my donor friends, it's 3% of IDA now. In 10 years, it'll be 30% of IDA. This is money well spent. But I need enterprises like The Economist to gradually educate the world that aid, is neither all wasted nor is subsidizing private investment anathema. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have reached the end of the allocated time, but I still have 3 people who have asked to, or would like to ask questions. Do you have time to take a very final round?
I've got 5 minutes, yeah.
Sure. Okay. The gentle. Oh, okay. Okay. There is a lady over there.
I'm Lizzie Hobbs. I'm a master's student at King's. It's kind of widely believed over the summer that the cooperation between the Italian government and the Libyan government was responsible for the kind of decline in numbers of refugees crossing the Mediterranean. I kind of wondered what kind of ideas you have for situations like Libya, where the haven country is actually very insecure and unsafe, and there are widespread, human rights abuses. So, kind of, what would you suggest there?
Okay, and the very final one, Antonio, over here.
So my question might be a bit too My question might be a bit too broad for the allocated time, but Antonio Sampaio here from the IISS. Speaking of the root causes of the refugee crisis, many organizations were trying to understand why this massive flux happened now and the differences from before. And I would like to pick your brain on your view on why this has happened now in recent years. So two broad, I think, streams of thought. One is that conflict and fragility, and conflict in fragile states were becoming more protracted. So they were lasting longer than before. Here in the strategic studies field, I think people were talking about the changing character of war, becoming more non-state and more protracted. And others say that, and perhaps even some of the same people say that it's also related to the higher power of human trafficking, smuggling networks, organized crime. So your views on, what were really in the immediate root causes of this phenomenon.
Sure. There was a third, or
No, he
right. Okay. God, I shouldn't have let myself in. Libya's hard. One of my former students is senior in the Libyan government. Very decent guy, smart. Libya is not really a haven country, it's a transit country, which is different. The people are not fleeing to Libya as a haven, they're fleeing to a coast and to a boat. And of course, not Libyans themselves fleeing. I think so there's two very different things. One is we need to get back to some sort of effective order in Libya, and that will mean some sort of political deal composed of the people who've got the guns. I mean, it's no good bypassing the people who've got the guns. To re-establish security, you've got to work with the people who have the guns. So that's part of it. And then there's a much larger agenda of who are the countries, which are the countries whose populations are fleeing to the coast, and that's Sahelian and sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, a lot of Nigerian. And that takes us to a very different issue of how to basically get Africa growing. That's my home territory. The last year I've been criticizing the German government with one voice, I've been working very closely with the German government with my other voice, because the German government brought me in to design their Africa initiative for the G20. They've been the president of the G20. And so I worked with them to come up with something called the Compact with Africa, which is an attempt to get private investment into a lot of African countries, not the fragile ones. So that's the best I can do on Libya. As to root causes, one of our commissioners is Jim Fearon, who's a sort of absolute specialist on this. Yes, conflicts are getting more protracted, and yes, big business, big criminal business has moved into this space. Criminal business likes fragile states. It's a very good environment. Lawlessness is what criminal business most wants, and so they actively encourage state fragility, and they encourage population movements because they make money out of it. Right? So both of these things apply. I don't have a 1-minute solution to them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've been extremely generous with your time and sharing your wisdom with us. I was commenting with some of the participants before we started that most of us had at some point cited your work in our own writing, and so it's really a great pleasure and privilege to have you here in person today. So I hope to see you back here.
Thank you. I think they put on products the line, we reserve the right to, we believe in continuous improvement, so we reserve the right to withdraw a product at any time. I reserve the right to withdraw an article at any time. Thank you.
Well, before we go, please join me in thanking.